Between the time frame 1945 to 68, what are the most fundamental breakthroughs in your opinion?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Between the time frame 1945 to 68, what are the fundamental breakthroughs in your opinion?
What were the fundamental breakthroughs,
Yeah.
domestically or internationally? Domestically in the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah, I assume you mean domestically within the United States. Probably the most significant up to 1968, up to the mid-1960s, was in fact the civil rights movement. After all, you have to bear in mind that in American history, there are two major original sins. This is typical, incidentally, of what's called the Anglosphere, the expansion of England through the world, the colonies that were settled by England, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. All of them, this entire Anglosphere was based on first expulsion or extermination of the indigenous population. That's one huge crime, unrequited, still exists, different forms in different places. And the other, specifically in the United States, was slavery. First slaves came in 1620, along with the earliest English colonists, and the history of state slavery continues literally without a break. It still continues today in other forms. Well, the civil rights, technically, slavery ended at the end of the Civil War, 1865. But that was only technically. There was a roughly 10-year period in which there were rights given to freed slaves. But about 10 years later, 1877, there was a compact between the North and the South, which essentially permitted the South to do essentially what it wanted. What they did was reinstate a form of slavery. It was done through criminalizing black life. So, for example, laws were established which meant which had the effect that, say, if a black man was standing on a corner, he could be arrested for vagrancy and charged maybe $10, which he didn't have, and sent to prison and wasn't able to pay the debt and stayed there forever. Or if somebody claimed that he'd been looking the wrong way at a white woman, he could be charged with attempted rape and given a much more serious sentence that he could never get out of. And through a combination of corrupt judges, corrupt sheriffs, racist institutions, plenty of violence. Ku Klux Klan was famous, but a lot more violence. What was called Jim Crow. Through these mechanisms, much of the black population was imprisoned. Mostly men, but later some women. That created a workforce which was far superior from the point of view of the owners to slaves. Slaves, remember, are capital. You have to keep your capital surviving if you're a slave owner. But if you can use imprisoned labor, that's perfect. The state's keeping them alive. You don't have to pay a penny. Furthermore, they're very disciplined. They're not going to strike. They're easy to punish them in all sorts of ways. So you get a disciplined, extremely cheap labor force that you don't have to pay for. And that's the basis for a large part of the American Industrial Revolution. U.S. Steel, coal industry, mining industry. What the familiar part of it is agribusiness, the chain gangs. But that was only a small part. It was a part of the whole industrial revival of the late 19th, early 20th century, was based on essentially slave labor, reinstitution of slavery. That went on until the Second World War, literally. during the Second World War, there was a need for what's called free labor in the war industries. So this criminalization system eroded, and especially black men, but also some black women, were able to work their way into the labor force in the war industries. Then came two decades of substantial economic growth, 1950s and the 60s. It was the highest growth period in the country's history, and also egalitarian growth. So the lowest quintile did about the same as the upper quintile. Unions were formed, they were strong, and the black population was able to begin to work its way into the general society. A black man could get a job in the auto industry. They had a pretty good union, UAW, buy a small home, make a little money, send his kid to college, just begin to be part of the society. And in the course of those 20 years, the civil rights movement took off. Started in the early 50s, reached a very important development in 1960 when a couple of black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in at a lunch counter, which was illegal, and of course North Carolina were immediately arrested. That could have been the end of it, but the next day more black students came. Pretty soon it turned into a kind of a flood. You got the organization of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Freedom Riders in the South. Pretty soon a burgeoning movement developed. It led to the great events like Birmingham, Selma, and others. Finally, the March on Washington, civil rights legislation. All of that was extremely important. And those were major developments. I mean, they've changed the society, undoubtedly. But we shouldn't overlook what happened afterwards. In the 1970s, the liberating effects of the 1960s went well beyond the civil rights movement. For example, the women's movement really took off in the late 1960s. It was its incipient stages. It had a major effect. That's probably the most effective, most long-standing effect on the society of any of the activist movements. It kind of was inspired in the 60s, took off mostly in the 70s. As far as the black movements were concerned, they hit a limit as soon as it turned to class issues. There is a close class-race correlation, and as the black and increasingly Latino issues, and incidentally it's included many women workers, as they began to reach up against the class barriers, there was a big reaction. Part of it was reinstitution of the criminalization of the black population that in effect restored a kind of slavery in the late 19th century. So if you take, say, the incarceration rate in the United States, take a look at it. Around 1980, it was approximately the same as the rest of the developed societies, rich societies, little on the high end, but not much within the spectrum. By now, it's out of sight. It's 5 to 10 times as high as the next of the wealthy societies. I think actually England is second, and but way beyond the level. It's overwhelmingly black males, increasingly black females, Latinos. It's not based on crime. It has nothing to do with increase in crime. The device that was used to recriminalize the black population was the drug war. Drug war is a total fraud. It has virtually nothing to do with drugs. The price of drugs doesn't change after 40 years of drug wars. The availability doesn't change. What the drug war has succeeded in doing is providing a device to criminalize the poor. And the poor in the United States happen to be overwhelmingly black and Latino, mostly males. So by now, it's a race war almost entirely from the first moment. Police, the orders given to the police as to how to deal with drugs. You don't go into the white suburbs and arrest some stockbroker who's sniffing coke in the evening, but you do go into the black ghettos, and if a kid has a joint in his pocket, put him in jail. So it starts with police actions, not the choice of the police themselves, but the orders given to them, the sentencing, which is grotesquely disproportionate, and on into the huge prison sentences, and then the highly punitive system that's instituted after, if anybody ever gets out of prison. The prisons aren't for rehabilitation, not in the United States. They're for punishment. When somebody spends a large part of his life there, he knows only one thing: how to be a criminal. When they get out, there's no jobs. There are conditions that bar them from getting jobs. Under Clinton, they were kicked out of public housing, other such devices. End result is something like reinstating Jim Crow. The black population now is, they don't call it slavery, but it's under conditions of impoverishment and deprivation that are extremely severe. And if you take a look at the whole 400 years of American history, 1620 up to the present, there's been about 20, maybe 30 years of relative freedom for the black population. That's a real scar on the society. And the great achievement of the civil rights movement can't be denied. It did change the country, but we shouldn't overlook the fact that it, as I said before, it set in motion forces which try to reverse those changes and essentially to protect class privilege. That's the crucial thing that has to be protected. Other things you can sort of deal with.